In the most recent election, the unincorporated town of Newcastle, Pennsylvania, made headlines for voting Republican for the first time since 1956. This small town, home to just a few thousand residents, cast its support for Donald Trump, marking a seismic political shift after more than 6 decades of reliably voting Democratic. One voter's comment encapsulated the rationale behind the shift, saying Trump seemed more attuned to the needs of everyday people rather than just the wealthy elite. She believed Trump understood that it was poor and working-class Americans who propelled him into office and hoped he would prioritize their needs. While this sentiment is undoubtedly earnest, it also reflects a profound misunderstanding of Trump's background, priorities, and policies. The man quite literally lives a life of opulence, famously owning a golden toilet in his New York penthouse. That image alone should shatter any illusions about Trump being relatable to the average working-class voter. Yet, this voter's belief that Trump's policies would focus on helping the most vulnerable reveals a disconnect between rhetoric and reality, a disconnect that many voters are now coming to terms with. The voter quoted above added a caveat to her optimism. Despite switching her political allegiance to support Trump, she expressed a growing concern that his administration might cut Social Security. Her plea was heartfelt. "We helped get you in office. Please take care of us. Please don't cut the things that help the most vulnerable." This anxiety is both understandable and tragic because it highlights the buyer's remorse that many voters are now feeling as they watch Trump's administration take shape. Let's be clear. The Republican Party, including Trump's allies, has long advocated for cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and other social safety net programs. They've been transparent about these intentions for years. So now, as reports surface about government plans to explore Social Security cuts under the guise of efficiency, there's no justification for surprise. This outcome was foreseeable and preventable. Voters were repeatedly warned that electing Trump and empowering Republican lawmakers would jeopardize these vital programs. Yet, many chose to ignore those warnings. The media, political analysts, and Democratic politicians sounded the alarm throughout the 2016 campaign. They laid out, in explicit detail, how Trump's tax cuts for the wealthy and deregulation agenda would inevitably lead to efforts to reduce spending on programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Despite these warnings, millions of voters brushed aside these concerns, convinced that Trump would defy party orthodoxy and protect these programs. Now, as those fears materialize, regret is setting in. Stories of disillusioned Trump voters have become increasingly common. Former Democrats who switched parties to support Trump are now grappling with the reality of his policies. Concerns about mass deportations, the economic fallout from tariffs, and threats to healthcare programs dominate the discourse among these voters. Many of them believe Trump's populist rhetoric and overlooked the hardline Republican agenda lurking beneath it. One particularly troubling aspect of this shift is how avoidable it was. Throughout the campaign, voters were repeatedly told not to trust Trump's promises. Experts warned that his policies would benefit the wealthy at the expense of the working class. Yet, many voters decided to ignore the evidence and gamble their futures on his words. Now they're facing the consequences. To illustrate this point, imagine being warned not to stick your hand in a bear trap because it will snap shut and cause severe injury. Despite repeated warnings, you do it anyway, and then act surprised when the trap closes on your hand. That's essentially what happened in this election. Voters were told exactly what to expect, but many chose to ignore those warnings and are now dealing with the fallout. None of this is to say that the concerns of working-class voters aren't valid. Many people feel left behind by the political establishment and see Trump's outsider status as a beacon of hope. But it's crucial to recognize the dangers of voting based on rhetoric rather than policy. Trump may have presented himself as a champion of the forgotten man, but his actions and alliances tell a different story, one that prioritizes the wealthy and powerful over everyday Americans. For instance, Trump's tax plan overwhelmingly favored corporations and the richest Americans. His administration's push to repeal the Affordable Care Act threatened healthcare access for millions. And now, discussions about cutting Social Security and Medicare only reinforce the notion that his policies are fundamentally out of step with the needs of working-class voters. So, what can be learned from this experience? First, voters must pay closer attention to policy details rather than being swayed by campaign rhetoric. Politicians can say anything to get elected, but their track records and policy proposals provide a much clearer picture of what they'll actually do in office. Second, accountability matters. Elected officials must be held responsible for the promises they make, and voters must be willing to admit when they've been misled. Finally, this situation underscores the importance of protecting social safety net programs. Programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and SNAP are lifelines for millions of Americans. Any attempts to weaken them should be met with fierce resistance, regardless of party affiliation. In conclusion, the story of Newcastle, Pennsylvania, serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of voting based on illusion rather than reality. While it's understandable that voters want leaders who seem to care about their struggles, it's essential to look beyond rhetoric and examine policies. Otherwise, we risk finding ourselves trapped in a cycle of disappointment and regret, just like the voters who helped elect Trump and are now worried about losing the very programs they rely on.